In Surah Jummah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He says, يُسَبِّحُ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ الْمَلِكِ الْقُدُّوسِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَكِيمِ. He's saying everything in this world is singing the praise, the perfection. Subhan means perfection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then He lists 4 names for Himself. He says Malik, meaning He's a king. Quddus means holy, that means He's holy. And then He says He's Azizul Hakim, right? He is one who is authoritative, has authority and honor. And He's somebody who is Hakim, He's wise, He's full of wisdom. So when you typically go to a kingdom, right? And if you go to some of the kingdoms where there's kings there, right? What is the first thing when you enter the city or when you enter the town? You see a big sign, right? Saying this is the kingdom belongs to so-and-so, king so-and-so. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is the first thing He says is that, He's Malik. So when He recites about what are the duties of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so He says, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ, right? And He says that we have sent a Rasul amongst them to do what, right? To teach them 4 things, right? Yatlu alayhim ayat, to recite to them the ayat. So when you typically see, right, in olden times when there was a messenger who would come representing the king, typically he would be carrying these banners and signs, right? So you would know which king this messenger is representing. So he's come here to teach us the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recite the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when you go to meet somebody and you say, hey, you have this invitation from this king, right? What are you supposed to do? So He teaches us some of the things like, you can't just show up dressed in front of king like whatever, right? You have to actually wear good clothes, purify yourself, have your hair combed, put on your best clothes possible because you're going to go meet a king. So you have to be presentable in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So purifying yourself, right? So what is the duty of Rasul? To show us the signs of the king, and then he's teaching us how to purify ourselves. And then when you have a kingdom, a king has a kingdom, but then he also has rules that you're supposed to follow. So he has authority. So when he has authority means he has rules, right? He has to give you some rules. So then what is the duty of the Rasul, right? To teach us the kitab. Yu'allimuhumul kitab, right? So he teaches the rules about how the king's rules or kingdom is there. And then along with that, when you sit with the king, right, and suppose you invited to a feast or somebody who's very, learned person, right? When you go and sit with that person, what is the one thing you are looking for? You're looking for some piece of advice, some wisdom that they will give you. Right? So when he gives you this wisdom, right, you're wanting there to go learn, right? You're not only there just to show up, right? You're always looking for some piece of advice this king is going to give you. So he's giving you this wisdom, right? So yu'allimuhum al-kitab wal hikmah. So now the problem is that, usually when you look in the Quran, right, a lot of times kitab comes with hikmah, right? Kitab is never alone. A lot of times what happens is people say, right, hey, I'm satisfied only by just reciting the Quran and looking at the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? I'm looking outside in the nature, and that's what keeps me happy. I'm done, right? Then there's other people who say, I'm going to just do deeds that purify my soul, right? I'm just going to focus on purifying my inner self, right? So I'm just going to do deeds, or I'm going to do ibadah that's just going to purify my soul. Then you have people who are saying like, no, right? What we need to do is follow Sharia down to the last piece of advice or Sharia is given to us, right? Now, what was the biggest problem with the Yahud, the Jewish people, right? They followed the kitab, but they left the hikmah out of the whole ruling, right? When you do something, when you follow Sharia, there's usually some kind of advice or hikmah or wisdom behind it, right? If you remember, right, if you go to Surah Isra, right, Allah says, I'm going to teach you the hikmah, the 10 commandments, but I'm going to teach you that with hikmah. What is the wisdom behind following those rulings, right? Then there's people who say like, I don't need the Quran, I don't need the Sharia, right? I just, follow my common sense. I'm going to follow my wisdom. The problem is that, when Rasul came in, he was tasked with doing four things. What were the four things? To show you, to recite to you the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to purify yourself, to give you the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but along with that, teach us the wisdom behind. Isa Nabi was sent to the Jewish community, was to establish whatever the rules or kitab of Musa was there, but his duty was primarily to teach the hikmah, the wisdom behind those rules. Now, in our society nowadays, right, this is very becoming a lot more prevalent, right? We have a lot of people who emphasize following Sharia. No problem with that. But then the problem is that when you are asking people to follow the Sharia, there are certain rules and guidelines around the wisdom around how you advise people on that Sharia, right? It shouldn't be just like, because I know this rule, I'm supposed to tell you, right? When you go to Surah Asr, right, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in Surah Asr, right? He says, Wal Asr innal insana lafi khusrin illa allazina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil haq. You teach haq, wa tawasaw bis sabr. So you're supposed to have patience, and not only the advisement of the haq. He didn't say anything. He says watawasaw, meaning it's mutual exchange of haq and mutual exchange of. If I shouldn't be the person who should just dish out the advice, right? I should also be able to listen to advice when somebody is giving me feedback. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. So let's talk about how to give this advice, right? A lot of times we hear the word amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar, right? So we have a lot of people who become this, what I call the police, right, who wants to advise people on how to do things, right? Now, which is great because it all fits in that criteria of amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar, enjoying good and forbidding evil. But the problem is that when you just do amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar without understanding the rules around how to engage based on Islamic Sharia and based on the Sunnah of our Prophet and our Imams, then we are certainly not doing justice and we are doing something wrong. So let's talk a little bit about how you would want to do based on our Sharia, Amr bil Maruf and Nahi Anil Munkar. The first part is that in the case of Amr bil Maruf, Nahi Anil Munkar, it is wajib to do it in the case of a wajib act. It is sunnah to do it in the case of a sunnah act. And it is munkar, or in the case of actually when there is something haram, then it's also wajib on it. So it's wajib in the case of wajib and haram, and it's sunnah in the case of a sunnah act. But is it wajib on everybody? Right? Is it wajib on everybody? No, the answer is that it's actually wajib kifai, which means if one person does it, it absolves the whole community from actually doing amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar, right? However, if not one person does it, then it's mandatory on the whole community, because then it becomes your responsibility to do it. Now, in the case of sunnah, as we talked about, it's a sunnah act. Now, the problem is that we should always keep in mind the level of understanding of the person in front of you before you, especially in the case of sunnah act, don't just go start advising. You should see the level of the person in front of you before you start giving them advice around amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar. Also, we shouldn't overburden somebody in the case of amr bil maruf nahi anil munkar when it comes to wajib acts. You have to see that, if this person is going to get overburdened, then you just give them the minimum requirements of the Sharia. Don't give them like the advanced version of what is going on, right? So with that background in mind, there's actually 5 conditions that apply when you do amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar, right? First is the fact that you yourself should have the knowledge about the ma'ruf and also about the munkar. You should have personal knowledge, right? You should know. For example, let's say drinking is haram. So drinking is haram, right? But then you should also know the context in which you're supposed to give the advice. So if somebody is holding a glass of a drink which is sparkling and bubbling, right? The problem is, you may think it's wine, But it could be also what? It could be ginger ale, it could be any carbonated drink. So because you don't know the context, right, at that point you shouldn't just go advise somebody. So you should be very sure that one, you know the rule, and two, that it actually applies in that situation, and you're very sure, then only you can go give the advice. So that's the certainty or the knowledge, right? The second part is that you believe that your word will be listened to and have an effect. So let me repeat it. You need to be sure that your word is going to be listened to, and then it should have an effect on you, right? Now, if you're not certain that, you're giving advice to this person is going to have an effect on this person, then in that case, Amr bil Maruf and Nahi Anil Munkar is not wajib. Again, the person has to listen to you, right? Your words are going to have an effect on this person, and he'll change his behavior. If you're not sure, then it's not wajib. The third condition is that the person is actually persistently doing something, right? So now, in the case of somebody, if somebody does something, like it happened, somebody did it once, right? And and it was only a slip, or it happened out of neglect, right? In that case, you are not supposed to actually do it, because that person can easily change his behavior. Like, it's the person who is the persistent person who's doing it persistently. That's where you actually go and do Amr bil Maruf. If it happens once in a while, then it's not necessary. So we shouldn't jump. And that's also, it's a part about respecting our fellow Muslim, right? If somebody did a mistake one time, you don't jump on them right away, right? You give them the chance to self-correct themselves. Also, the person to be advised also believes, so this is the fourth condition, the person that you're giving the advice to also believes that they are wrong. So, for example, right, if this person, and I'm trying to figure out an example, right? So he knows that what he's doing is, or neglecting, is wrong. So the person you're giving this advice to, he also will understand what he's doing is wrong. Now, in the case where if somebody believes that they are not wrong, and you give them Amr bil Maruf Nahi Anil Munkar, and they believe they are not wrong, then it's not wajib on you. So a good example would be, for example, if there's a marja out there who allows his followers to, for example, shave their beard. Now, in that case, they think they are right. So in that case, you are not supposed to go do the Amr bil Maruf and Nahi Anil Munkar. So it's the person that you're advising to also acknowledges that they are wrong. If they say I'm not wrong, then it's not valid on you. And then the last part is, this is something that applies to us today a lot more, right? With the political situation and scenario that is going on, a lot of times you have to be careful in what you say, where you say, right? Because if you are not sure that, if you do this Amr bil Maruf and Nahi Anil Munkar, and if it's going to cause you harm, or your property, or your Amr bil Maruf Nahi Anil Munkar going to cause a harm to the community or the person you're giving the advice to, right? So it shouldn't harm the person, the honor of that person or their property, or yourself, for example. In that case, you're not supposed to do it. So you've got to be very sure when you're going to do this that it doesn't harm the honor or the respect of the property or that person. Now, there is three ways to do Amr bil Maruf Nahi Anil Munkar. One is with the heart. That's the first step. The second is with your tongue. And then the third one is with your hand. Now, I'm going to kind of clarify what that means, right? So the first one is where you do it with your heart. So for example, if you know somebody is doing something wrong, right? So in that case, the first step is with the heart, means you actually try to sever the relationship with that person without actually saying anything, or don't talk to that person, right? Or avoid that person to the point where that person starts recognizing something is wrong. So that's the first step. What is the first step we usually do? Hey buddy, you're doing something wrong, right? That's the first step we do, right? The first step is actually doing it with your heart. Just the fact that you're avoiding this person should be enough to actually make him recognize they're doing something wrong, right? The second mode is actually with the tongue. That's the second step, not the first step. First step is with your heart, second step is your tongue, right? Now, you should try to correct this person without actually humiliating this person. So you cannot just correct this person just because, you shouldn't humiliate the person. Another way to do this is, give them some hadith or the ayah from the Quran, which validates what you're saying, right? And do it in a civil and sympathetic manner. Right? Now, there is cases where some people, if you exhort them in public in a civil manner, they feel embarrassed, where they will correct their behavior. So there's another mode to do that, but you got to know. So moral of the story, you got to know what effect the person will have depending on the mode of what you're trying to communicate, right? Without trying to disrupt the honor of the person you're trying to do. The third mode is the physical mode. Now, the physical mode typically applies in the case of people who have power, right? For example, the government or people who are sanctioned by the imam, right, to do that thing. In our case, the only thing we applies to us would be, right, for example, you remove the object with which the harm can be caused, or you remove the person from the object that's going to cause the harm. So you kind of don't try to go it into a mode where it's going to cause harm, right? And the other one, that level of hand or the punishment used is typically depending on the permission of the imam. So that kind of gives you an idea about how to practice amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar. And hopefully this gives you a guideline to not only how to interact with people of our own community, but also when you go outside, right, how you communicate with people and how you provide amr bil maruf and nahi anil munkar. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad sallallahu. Usually, I try to do the Jummah khutbah with two different types of uh, uh, scenarios. In first part, I usually try to talk something about fiqh. In the second part, I usually try to address something from the Quran and try to weave it back into some sort of lesson or learning we can learn from, right? There is a very beautiful scenario or scene that's happening in Surah Al-Insan or Surah Dahr, right? Surah number 76. The ayah number is from 7 to 9, right? And then in this ayah, Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, He says, Yufuna bin nadri wa yakhafuna yawman kana sharruhu mustatira. He says they fulfill their vows and fear a day whose evil will be widespread. So the scene is that Allah is describing these people who are in Jannah, right? And they are drinking from the Hawd Kausar, and they're drinking this drink of kafur, right? It's a heavenly drink. And then he's describing that these are the people who fulfill their vows, fear a day whose evil will be widespread. So he's describing that these people are fulfilling their nadhr. Nadhr means oath, vow, right? And then he continues and he says, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ. So they feed food, right? Allah hubbehi, right? Out of love. In spite of their love for the food, they're giving away their food. Who are they giving their food away to? Miskinan wa yatiman wasir. They're giving away their food to the poor, right? The needy person, to the orphan, and to the captive. So now let me describe to you the story, actually, right? So one day, both Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain alayhi salam were young. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad So they were both not feeling well, right? So our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came to visit them. So when he came to visit them, he asked Bibi Fatima what was going on. She said they were not feeling well. So he said, why don't you do another, that when they get better, you will fast for 3 days. So Imam Ali and Bibi Fatima both there, they said, okay, we will do the nazar to actually fast for 3 days. Now fast forward, they got better. So now time to fast, right? So both Imam Ali and Bibi Fatima said, we will fast. So along with them, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain also said, we will fast. So the four of them fast. They had their Kaniz, Bibi Fizza, who was also in the house. So she said, I will fast too. So these 5 people started fasting. On the first day, they fasted. Bibi Fatima made 5 pieces of bread, and she kind of gave it to every one of them. When it came time to iftar, there was a knock on the door. And then there was a poor person that was on the door, right? So, and Imam Ali went and opened the door. This poor person was there. So Imam Ali gave his bread to this person. So Bibi Fatima gave her bread, right? And then so Imam Hassan, Imam Hussain gave their bread. And then, Bibi Fizza also, she gave her bread also. So the first day they didn't eat anything. They just drank water and salt, opened their fast, and they were done. Next day again, second day of fasting, they had to finish their nadhr, right? So they continued with their fast the second day. She again made 5 pieces of bread. The second day there was a knock on the door again at iftar time, right? And there was an orphan at the door, and all 5 of them gave away their pieces of bread, right? And then they opened their fast with water and salt, and they were done. Now it is the third day of fasting. Again, she made 5 pieces of bread. She gave the 5 pieces of bread to each one of them, right? And then there was a knock on the door, and there was an asir, meaning a person who was captive, right? He had been freed. He came on the door. So they gave their bread again, right? All 5 of them did. Now, they opened the fast. Guess what? At that time, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain were really young. So they were really weak by that time. Imagine not eating something for 3 days and fasting, right? So Bibi Fatima told Imam Ali, why don't you take them to their grandfather? And maybe looking at him, they will cheer them up. So Imam Ali took Imam Hassan, Imam Hussain alayhi salam to Rasulullah. When they came to Rasulullah immediately asked what's going on. So he says, we've been fasting for 3 days and, they're hungry, but we haven't been able to eat anything. So he said, what about my daughter? So she's going through the same thing. So Rasulullah said, let's go back to Bibi Fatima. So they all came back to Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. At which time is these 3 verses of the Holy Quran in Surah Insan, ayah number 70, Surah number 76, ayah number 7, 8, and 9. And what did it says? I'm going to redo this ayahs, right? So it says they fulfill their vows. They fulfill their nadhr, right? And fear a day, right? The day of judgment, right? In which evil will be widespread. And then what do? They give their food in spite of love for it, right? To who? To the needy, to the poor, and to the orphan, and to the captive. And then he continues and says, and what do they say when they feed these poor people? They say, right, we feed you only for the for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we wish not from you reward or gratitude. So we don't want any reward or gratitude from you. So imagine this scenario, right, where this ayah is come in honor of the Ahlul Bayt, right, who have been fasting, right? And then when this ayah came in, their whole soul was filled with the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were not hungry anymore. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But also shows that, when you do a nadhr, so let's talk about what this nadhr actually means, right? And inshallah, we will try to, figure out what that means, right? So nadhr is basically where you take a oath or a vow, right? Where you pledge that you will do something or refrain from something for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Now, what are the conditions, right, for doing the nadhr? The first condition is that you should always say for lillah, for, qurbatan illallah, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It can be in any language, right? It's whatever language you're in, you should be a person who should be baligh. You should be akil, right? And you should do it out of your own choice. And you should have the intention of taking this nadhr, right? Now, it should also be something that should be possible for you to do. Don't take a nadhr which is actually not possible or something that's going to be very difficult for you to do. So that's the other condition for it. In the case of wife or a child, right? Typically if it's a nadhr that's going to interfere with the rights of the husband, then she has to take the permission of the husband. In the case of, and then once the husband gives the permission, he cannot retract it back afterwards, right? If he gave you permission one time. As far as a child goes, they don't have to take permission from their parents, father or mother. But if the parents find out afterwards and they know about it, and if they prohibit the child from following through, then it's not wajib. So that's the condition for the nadhr, right? There's two types of nadhr. One is conditional and one is unconditional. So I'm going to give you some examples, right? So an unconditional nadhr is like, for example, I make nadhr for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'll fast tomorrow. It's an unconditional nadhr. I don't want anything. I'm just doing it for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Or, I make nadhr that for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I will walk during Arba'in next year in Karbala, for example. So that's an unconditional. You're not putting any condition on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to follow through with something for you. You're just doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, conditional one is, there's these examples, right? So, for example, I make another, the earlier ayahs I recited, right, where the two sons were sick, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussain, and the parents took another that when they get better, I will fast. So I make nadhr that if Allah gives health to my sons, right, I will fast for 3 days. So that's a conditional nadhr, right? Or I make nadhr, right, that if Allah gives success to my daughter in her exam, right, I will donate $100 to the Shia. Or so this is doing good stuff, right? Then there is bad stuff, for example, right, if I drink alcohol again, for example, right, I'm going to donate $100 to charity. So if I do a haram act or something, then I'm going to donate. Or in the case of a makruh act, for example, I go to the graveyard and I'm laughing and making fun and those type of things. So then in that case, I will fast for 3 days. So that's also another. So you can do it in case of wajib act, mustahab act, right, to do something. Or you can be a punitive thing, right, if you do something haram or do something makruh. So you can kind of come up with something that will be a punitive act. Now, the part about doing a nazar is that there is no validity on doing a mubah act. Mubah act is meaning a neutral act. Now, unless that act is going to be an example to the general community, is going to be for the benefit of the community, then you should do it. But other than that, if it's not wajib, mustahab, makruh, or haram, then there is no validity on a mubah act unless it's done for the betterment of the community. The fulfillment of the nadhr should be done exactly as you specified in the condition. For example, if you say that I'm going to give charity on the first day of the month, or I'm going to fast on the first day of the month, then that's what you're supposed to do. You cannot violate the condition of the nadhr, cannot do it some other day, right? Now, there is kafara for not following through. So if, for example, if you don't do it, now of course there is sin there, right? But you can expiate the sin by actually paying a kafara, right? So kafara would be like, for example, free a slave. Doesn't apply to us, can't do that. You can feed 10 people, 10 poor people, or you can clothe 10 poor people, and that would be a kafara enough. If you can't do it monetarily, then you should fast for 3 days. So that expiates you from the nadhr, for example. Now let's talk about a different scenario, which is called a qasam. So what's the difference between nadhr and qasam, right? Nadhr means you're doing something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the case of qasam, right, you are taking an oath or you're swearing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, right, there's 3 types of qasam, right? For example, there is a qasam where you are, confirming events in the past, present, or future, right? So in this case, right, if it's true, for example, so I say, by Allah, Zaid came yesterday. I took Allah's name as an oath, right? And then I mentioned a fact. Now that actually is makruh, right? You shouldn't be using Allah's name just because, right? In this case, even though it's a known fact, right? If it's a false statement, by Allah, Zaid came yesterday and he didn't come, if it's a lie, it's actually haram. You cannot take Allah's name in a false statement. Also, another one is, hey, Taqiba, I swear by Allah, right, give me $100. Right? That actually is meaningless, right? Because there is no validity in it. Invoking Allah's name to ask for something, right? That actually is no, because you're imposing it on somebody else, right? So you emphasize a request. You just ask, give me, right? Don't say for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I request you by Allah. Now, the one that applies to us is actually when you pledge or commit to do something or refrain from something. For example, I swear by Allah, I will fast tomorrow. Now you invoked Allah and you put a condition on your self, right? Or by Allah, I will stop smoking tomorrow, right? So, this type of qasam is what is relevant to us, right? And, so in this case, you must be baligh, right? You should do it out of your own free will, right? Nobody should be forcing you. And the same condition applies, right? You shouldn't be doing it in the case of anger, right? As far as the wife goes, same thing again. She has to seek permission from her husband if it applies to rights of the husband, right? And in the case of child, same thing. They have to seek permission from their parents, right? It can be uttered in any language, right? The condition is actually that you should invoke the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in it, right? You can use the name of Allah, or you can take a instance where only Allah can do it, for example, by the person or by the entity who parted the sea of Musa was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's you're addressing Allah. Or you're using Allah's attributes, right? Rahman, Rahim, all the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, right? So, it should be something like Wallah, Billah, or even Tallah, right? Those are all oaths that you're supposed to take, right? Now, in our case, we have this tendency of sometimes we take qasam on behalf of the names of the Prophet or the Imams, or to any of the holy places. However, it's permissible, but it doesn't have any validity as far as enforceability. So it's not you can take an oath, fine, but it's not a valid. So if you don't do the qasam, there is no kafara on it. Especially when you're doing it, the condition is the only time it applies is when you actually take the qasam with Allah's name in it. So that's the time when and then it also is something where there should be no barat on you, right? For example, like if I don't this, then I'm a kafir. That doesn't apply, right? So those are type of examples. It must be done verbally, right? If somebody can't speak, they can write it down, right? And it should be something that you can actually do. Don't take a qasam to do something which is next to impossible or something very hard to do. It shouldn't be excessively difficult, right? And again, it should be with regards to something wajib or mustahab, or something that is avoiding is something that is haram or makruh in this case, right? How about if somebody doesn't complete their qasam? What happens there? Again, same thing. It's a sin, right? If you invoke Allah's name and say I'm going to do this or not do this, right? So there's a kafara. Again, same thing. You feed 10 people. 10 poor people, or you clothe 10 poor people. And in this case where if you cannot do both of those items, then you are supposed to fast for 3 days. That just gives you an idea about the whole thing, right? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Allahumma inni as'aluka mujibati rahmatik wa zaima maghfiratik wal ghanimata min kulli birrin was salamata min kulli ithmin. Allahumma la tada' li zamban illa ghafart wa la hamman illa farajta wa la sukman illa shafait wa la aiban illa satarta wa la rizqan illa basattahu wa la khawfan illa amantahu wa la su'an illa saraftahu. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min nafsin la tashba'u wa min qalbin la yakhsha ومن علم لا ينفع ومن صلاة لا ترفع ومن دعاء لا يسمع. اللهم إني أسألك يسرا بعد العسر والفرج بعد الكرب ورخاء بعد الشدة. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من فتنة النار وعذاب النار وأعوذ بك من فتنة القبر وأعوذ بك من عذاب القبر وأعوذ بك من فتنة الغنى وأعوذ بك من فتنة الفقر. O Allah, give us the resolve to use the examples of the martyrs of Karbala and the Aimma, right, to stand up against injustice wherever it may be found. O Allah, we ask you for all that is good in this world and in the hereafter. O Allah, we seek refuge with you from all evil in this world and in the hereafter. O Allah, we ask you for the good that your servant and prophet has asked you for. We seek refuge with you from evil from which your servant and prophet sought refuge from. Oh Allah, we ask you for paradise and for that which brings one closer to it. And we seek refuge in you from hell and from that which brings one closer to it. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Allahumma ighfir lil mu'minina wal mu'minat wal muslimina wal muslimat al ahya'i wal amwat tabi'a bainana bainahum bil khairat innaka mujibud da'wat innaka ala kulli shay'in qadir. Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala an-nabi ya ayyuhallazina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima.